Welcome all to my talk on Heidegger and some Hegel, which is entitled Thinking Death as Place. A very weird title, I see that. Now, I've written a thesis and now a book on Heidegger on death, and this is something I thought about with Heidegger, is that it's something quite strange that he talks about death as a place, it seems. Now, before I begin, as always, feel free to subscribe, leave a comment and support the channel on Patreon and other ways, for example on PayPal. Or I'm also teaching a course actually on Heidegger on death and being, which will start end of June. There'll be 4 seminars in total, so if you're interested, send me an email. There's lots of people have let me know that they're quite interested, so I have to see how many places we have. But yeah, just let me know if you are keen to take the course. So again, Thinking Death as Place. How is this title supposed to make any sense? How could death be a place? Death is, if it is at all, utter negativity, the utter opposite of life and of positivity, not some place we could even begin to imagine. In fact, the imagination is at a loss here. What else would this be but another fanciful nonsense from some pesky German thinker? Death is, says Hegel, most terrifying. If death were a place, then, if anything, it would be a most terrifying place. To remain with Hegel, death is most terrifying, though, for what? Für den Verstand, for the understanding. That means for Vorstellung. Because what is dead cannot anymore be held firmly and manifestly before oneself for Vorstellung. But the dialectics here also works in the other way, which means that it is actually the understanding, it is Vorstellung, the Verstand, representation that wants to hold on to something, as for example formal logic does to logic, but no longer understands logic as the living, breathing logos and its activity. And in that sense, the Verstand, the understanding and representation, kill and make dead. Formal logic is the logic of death. So you see the dialectics here works quite neatly. Now Hegel continues, but not the life that shies away from death, weirdly enough, and safeguards against devastation pure and simple, but the life that bears death and that preserves itself in death is the life of spirit. I have emphasized, and there would be a lot more to say on Hegel here, but this time it's on Heidegger. I've emphasized in death, in ihm in German, because this seems to suggest perhaps a certain locality of death, present even in Hegel. I don't want to conflate Hegel with Heidegger and claim that death in Heidegger is a marker for negativity as it is for Hegel. However, thinking death as a place is necessary, it seems, even for Hegel. Life, sheer immediate positivity, needs to stride through death in order for life to include immediacy in its immediacy. Spirit is to dwell with negativity, as Hegel says, that this dwelling is the magic power which turns the negative into being. End of quote. We are all too familiar with the terminology of dwelling as readers of Heidegger. Death as negativity to Hegel appears to be a place in which spirit needs to dwell in order for being to assume its proper and full potential. Hegel does not explicitly address and articulate the apparent spatial sense he attributes to death. With Heidegger, this is radicalized, and Heidegger brings this to the fore. Death is explicitly articulated as a place, and not just any place. Death is determined and understood and explicated as the Gebirg des Seins, literally the mountain range of being. In the Beiträge, Heidegger points out that death comes in many Gestalts, in vielen Gestalten. The Gebirg is thus one of those Gestalts of death which man knows of. The Gebirg is one of the ways in which death manifests itself for man's destiny. Heidegger publicly speaks of death as Gebirg for the first time in the Bremer Vorträge of 1949. There, Heidegger writes, quote, "As the shrine of the North, der Schrein des Nichts, death is the Gebirg of being. The mortals are who they are as mortals by assenting in the Gebirg of being. They are the abiding, wesende relationship to being as being." In a footnote added in the same year, 1949, to the introduction of What is Metaphysics, Heidegger writes, quote, "Letting death come towards oneself, holding oneself in the arrival of death as the Gebirg of being," and being is here crossed out. This note, it was just a bit, autobiographical note. When I read this for the first time, I think in 2013, I was in Munich at the time, spent a week in Munich and read this in the Staatsbibliothek. This note, which is den Tod auf sich zukommen lassen, als das Gebirg des Seins, as the mountain range of being, and I wanted to understand what this strange notion meant. And then I spent the next 5 years researching this and thinking it through. I hope I thought it through, haven't just researched it. And it's led to the PhD on the matter, and also to the book, and of course to the course as well that I mentioned before. So it was all this one footnote. A being here is being crossed out, indicates that being is at the center of the fourfold, of the Gefühl, of the gathering of the four poles, of divinities, mortals, earth and sky, holding together the relationality of the four poles. Mortals are to take a relational stance with their mortality. The footnote is added to the following sentence. We have to think standing in the openness of being, carrying out the standing in care, and persisting in the uttermost being towards death, altogether as the full essence of existence. Now it's also quite interesting just to perhaps mention this as a side note. Heidegger keeps coming back to his texts and adds footnotes to them quite often, which are subsequently, they're published and they've got the year added to when he added the footnote. And they show you something about the thinking path and how thought explicates itself here. In a poem to Hannah Arendt, dated from 1950, a poem Heidegger dedicates to Arendt's friend Hilde Fränkel, who was terminally ill at the time of writing. Heidegger also speaks of death as Gebirg. This is the poem. Tod ist das Gebirg des Seins im Gedicht der Welt. Tod entrettet deins und meins ans Gewicht das Feld, in die Höhe einer Ruhe, rein der Stern der Erde zu. And here's my attempt at a translation. Death is being's mountainous region, the mountain range of being, in the poem of the world. Death will save and at once free us from what's yours and mine, pushing toward the weight that falls toward the height of a silence, purely toward the star of earth. What should all of those quotes tell us, other than Heidegger's philosophy is after all just quackery, charlatanry, bad poetry, and downright ridiculous and perhaps pessimistic at best? Death is the mountain range of being is at best meaningless word magic. At worst, the reduction of being to morbidity. But maybe Heidegger did see something here. Maybe he did see a gestalt of death that had been covered over before. And that speaks to the fissures of being itself. Let me try to read the poem Death is the mountain range of being in the poem of the world, and as such, death saves and shields and protects and safeguards. Death saves and protects, and in so doing frees from the division between the I and the thou. The weight could be thought of, perhaps, if this is not too associative, as the heavy weight of Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, the weight of attempting to live as if one returns forever and has to live the same life over and over again. Death then would be what gives weight, what frees us for that weight. For death is what gives weight and meaning to existence and pulls back unto the earth into a silent releasement. That is the silent affirmation of finitude and imperfection in an all too well organized, controlled, global surveillance economy. What is death here? Death is not demise. Death is not simply merely the end of someone's life. If we take Heidegger seriously here, then death as the mountainous region of being is whence the freeing for the heavy weight, for the full essence of existence comes. Furthermore, if death is the mountainous region of being, then we have to think death on the level of being and think it such that from this level it translates up onto the level of mortals. As a mountainous region, death is a barely accessible place, or it's not available. It is where being hides and conceals itself. It's not available for control, more precisely. Death, then, is the resting place of being. It is the refuge of being, perhaps. The sanctuary, perhaps, too. And how far is death the place where being conceals itself? We have to ask, how does being essentially sway or abide? Being is Anwesen, but in so far, presence, but in so far, but in and for its presence it is concealed. It is the clearing for self concealing. In the German and in the concealing, you have the Bergen of Gebirge. In the German, the root verb of what is translated as disclosing, concealing and concealing, Bergen, verbergen, and Bergen is Bergen. Bergen means to bring to safety, to protect, to harbor, and to shelter. We can thus understand perhaps death as Gebirg, often hyphenated by Heidegger, as the gathering. And if you want to read more on this, you should read some of his essays on Heraclitus and Parmenides, where he also talks about this. So death, and as the Gebirg, is the gathering, the concentration of Bergung, of concealing, harboring, sheltering, safeguarding, of the open, of the clearing of being. Why Heidegger would call death the place of gathering of all Bergung. What is Bergen? Bergen is the sheltering disclosure, giving heed to the disclosed beings in their being, rather than forcefully and manipulatively demanding them to function. Thus Bergung is mindful of and respects the law of aletheia. That whatever is disclosed simultaneously covers over, that any disclosure is only possible at once with covering over, with hiding and concealing and withdrawal. The opposite of this, of Bergen namely, is what Heidegger calls Stillen. It is no coincidence that Heidegger ends the section on the in contributions on the machine and machination. So he also mentions the destruction of the earth and the displacement and uprooting of the worker. In the world of machines, the Bergung of truth is corrupted to a mere positioning, stellen, placing, forceful placing in all things in a neatly operable warehouse of immediate availability. In the Nachlass, in the unpublished notebooks, Nietzsche warns of an uncanny wheelwork with ever more finely adapted, ever more finely attuned wheels, of the total economic management of the earth that is inevitably in store for us. Stellen, placing or putting, is a corruption of Bergen, because it seeks to fundamentally and radically manipulate rather than to disclose in a carefully sheltering manner, in a letting occur of beings and of truth. Is it a coincidence that in such an age as ours, man seems to rush towards promises of immortality and self-aggrandizement of other sorts? We have, after all, apparently arrived at the Anthropocenic age, the age of geoengineering, where, to quote some rather famous environmentalist, where we are now in the position of building the planet. Apparently mortals are now in the business of building planets. The ultimate hubris, some might think this is, and the possibility of virtual infinite prolonging of life qua conscious states of experiences seems right around the corner. And as Heidegger himself noted in his last public interview with Richard Visser on the human being, the human being is about to be produced just as that eerie wheelwork needs the human being. And Heidegger says this very often, that human beings will be produced in a factory, and I think this is not just an exaggeration. It is an exaggeration, perhaps, but it's also, he's pointing to, Gestell does not need factories. Gestell will produce the human being, it already is producing the human being, humanoids that are replicas of the identities that are available to buy. And those identities are manifold and are, yes, they are. Gestell produces human beings not in factories. It produces them in rather more subtle ways. Now, in an essay which is Vom Wesen und Begriff der Physis, which is usually translated as On the Essence and Concept of Physis, Heidegger argues that if life in itself would become some technological fake product, at the same moment there would no longer be health, birth, nor death. End of quote. That is, there would no longer be mortals, but only organized, streamlined, positioned, rational animals executing the tasks of technology. Organized by an organization that no one would quite know where it came from. An utterly historyless realm. And being would have no resting place. There would be no being, that means. It would burst into an unstoppable gigantomachia against itself. Why then is death the place where being hides and finds refuge? Death as place is the inaccessible, that which slips from manageability and controllability. Death as the place of gathering, of all Bergen, is the last of all concealing and sheltering and harboring. It's the last refuge, perhaps, of being where, as it were, being is relieved or even freed from itself and its current fate. Gestell, positionality. This intimate relationship of being and death is translated to the level of mortals. Mortals are those beings who have to carry out and withstand this tension rather than run from it. To bridge this with what I outlined above with regards to Hegel, death is terrifying to Vorstellung, to representation, to the understanding also, that needs to corroborate all things in front of itself in a constant and homogenized, also I would say, availability. Death withdraws from the demands of Stillen, and as such it is the refuge of being, its hiding place from itself. In being and time, death is the ownmost possibility of Dasein. Ivo De Gennaro argues in his book The Weirdness of Being that man needs again, now, today, to take a mortal stance, that means to come into his own. Following François Dastur, a French philosopher, man needs to be in death, according to the late Heidegger. In death, or with death. Das Sein zum Tode, be, which is usually translated as being towards death, perhaps actually means Sein beim Tode, being with death. We can say in German, Gasthaus zum Wanderer or Wandersmann. I can't think of anything better. That means the pub at the, which doesn't make any sense actually. The pub at the hiker. It doesn't translate well. So you could, the Gasthaus zum something. It's at a place. It's where something is. And so das Sein zum Tod is being with death, perhaps more than being towards death. Now, For the later Heidegger, becoming mortals means that we become human. We have to become mortals. That's how we become human, and that means to think death as Gebirg, as the utter concealment and sheltering place of being, which for being is that which has always already withdrawn. Now, to come back to what Heidegger says about the mountain range, man needs to be in death as the mountain range and refuge of being. Man needs to bear the burden of Bergen rather than being the executing animal of limitless manipulation operating under the fantasy of becoming the Homo Deus. To be in death, following Hegel, is the life of Geist. That's where spirit is. Yet with Heidegger we have even a richer story, perhaps, of the tension between being and death than with Hegel. With Hegel, the lines, it seems, are drawn, the negative sublates the positive unto its proper mediated immediacy. With Heidegger, the result is unclear. Death as a refuge of being means that being can rest there, but also that being here withdraws into that place, and that being therefore is barely accessible and denies itself. And think also of it as the mountain range. If we are mortals and we dwell in this mountain range, what we are striding through is the mountain range, is death itself of the fissures of being, and it is in this fog that we always already are as mortal beings, as so far as we are mortals, which would be very far from claiming that we can actually build a planet according to our needs, and of course the needs of the environment as well. Now, it's a bit more humble, perhaps, to think of ourselves as mortals than builders of planets or inhabitants of Mars. A bit more humble. Being dwells in death, and it can get lost in its mountain range. Being can leave, can abandon beings. Not many things are. Just because I can say I am does not mean that I am. And it is for being's relationship with death that it can do so. Death is the place where being rests, but simultaneously also where being can abandon beings and lose itself. The human being is the being where the tension is carried out for the human being's relationship with death and with being. And in this sense, we have to understand Heidegger's seemingly odd claims that the human being has to become the mortal being. Only by appreciating this can we understand what it is that Heidegger says in the late 40s and 50s, that the human being is not yet the mortal being. If mortals fail to become what they are, the equilibrium of the fourfold is at stake. The very equilibrium of the world is at stake. True, the human being has no control over being, but as Heidegger continuously points out, the essence of the human and the essence of being are wesensverwandt, essentially related. Thus there is reason to assume an influence of human activity over the fate of being. Why else would we need to ask the Seinsfrage? It is a task of the human as mortal being to engage in acts of Bergung, and as such allow being to withdraw without abandoning beings entirely. That is the task of the poet. Different from Hegel, the precise outcome is unclear with Heidegger. There is no outcome perhaps at all. Yet Heidegger's thinking is a planting of seeds rather than an implicit will to absolute control. Heidegger writes, quote, "The mortals are who they are as mortals by ascending in the mountain range of being. They are the abiding, wesende relationship to being as being. They are that relationship because they are mortal. That is to say, those who carry out the tension of being and death, and the way this is carried out matters for the fate of being. This carrying out can be performed if mortals are in death, in that place of concealment, of harboring, sheltering, rather than in the assumed transparency of manipulation, where nature is just an open book of mashable data, where nature is not even enough anymore, where now, of course, it's entire planets that we're building." Now also Heidegger's notorious notion of man as the placeholder of the nothing, which means that the human being frees a place for the totally other than beings, for being itself, which makes any differentiation possible, should now be clearer. The human being as the mortal being carries the shrine that is death, to the naught. Compared to contemporary fantasies of omnipotence and omniscience, of immortality and transhumanist fancy, Heidegger's promise, of course, appears bleak. Humans, as long as they are human, however, are mortally finite. Yet not just this. Humans shall also dwell in death as the mountain range. Why? For the human being is the shepherd of being, says Heidegger, which now means the human being in the community of mortals guides being towards and into its refuge, death, and listens and hearkens carefully to its more fundamental call, rather than to the current demands of its current fate, a fate that drives being to abandon itself and beings. Without death, without becoming mortals, we will not shelter what we call the planet. We will not be able to shelter and safeguard the earth. We will become great destroyers. So thank you very much as always, and hope you keep well.